All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I appreciate you carving time out of your schedule to participate in this webinar where we're going to be talking a little bit about the hidden risk of having armed security in your church. We appreciate the thoughtfulness that went into a lot of the questions that we saw on Facebook around the promotions of this webinar. And I can tell that this is a heated topic that churches are divided on what to do and regarding keeping our churches safe and secure. And this issue and topic around having armed security or not having armed security is definitely a polarizing topic that it drives a lot of conversation. And we're just anxious to engage in that discussion today, and we're glad you're here. I'm going to be your host. My name is Craig Cable. I'm with Group Publishing. I'm the Church Safety and Security Director here, and I'll give you a quick little background on me. I'm involved in my own church's security team. I'm a leader and tactical trainer for that team. I also provide security consulting for churches around the country. I'm involved in consortium of church security teams called the Northern Colorado Christian Security Roundtable. And I'm just passionate about finding ways and developing communities around keeping our churches safe. I'm also a firearms instructor, range safety officer, and I'm trained in a variety of different skills and abilities around active shooter, tactical trauma, crisis intervention, and tactical communication. We want to make sure that you are all able to participate in this webinar. So if there's any technical issues that you run into along the way, use your chat box feature. You can just type in that you're having a problem hearing or having any issues with the slides, and we have people standing by that can respond to those questions. We also would like for you to submit your questions. If you hear something that's shared that provokes a question that you'd like an answer to, we'd encourage you to use your Q&A box. Post your question, and we'll be monitoring those questions. And if there's kind of a consistent question or a theme that keeps coming up, we'll try to address that question live on air here on the webinar. I'd like to introduce my guest, Steve Case. He's from Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are.
Yes. Well, tell us a little bit about your role at Brotherhood Mutual.
Sure. I'm Assistant Vice President, Senior Corporate Counsel at Brotherhood Mutual. I've been in this position for about 4 years. And before that, I worked in insurance defense, so I was representing folks after something had allegedly happened. About 4 years ago, I came over to Brotherhood Mutual, and now I get to work with ministries on a day-in, day-out basis with proactive risk management strategies. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And this is kind of what I live for. It's what gets me up in the morning, is helping ministries basically prevent some of the risks and concerns that are out there. I do, however, have to give my attorney disclaimer every single time, and that is I can't offer legal advice because I don't know what state folks are in, and I'm not licensed in every state. But I do hope that as we talk today, that we can talk about some good risk management practices and some of the issues that ministries are already facing across the country.
Well, Steve, thank you for being here. We are thrilled by the partnership that group has really we're so gratified to be able to partner with an organization like Brotherhood Mutual. You're celebrating your 100 years of
Yes.
serving the local church. And I think we both, not only group and Brotherhood Mutual, but you and I both have just strong perspectives and a passion for serving the local church and protecting our flock. And I really appreciate your insights and just perspective on what are the ways to mitigate some of these risks and how do we serve those who are serving in our local church more effectively. So thank you for coming today.
Absolutely. Glad to be a part of this.
Well, we'd like to get a feel for who's on the webinar today, and we've seen a variety of roles represented who have an interest in this topic. So we're going to be launching a poll. You hopefully will see a poll that gives you an opportunity to select whether or not you're a church security team leader, maybe you're a member of a church security team, maybe you're on staff or an elder or a deacon or someone part of the ministry organization. Maybe you're just a passionate congregation member who is concerned about concealed carry and how does that apply? Or maybe you have a totally different other role that you'd like to identify. And if you check other I would love for you to use your chat box and identify what that role is. We'd love to just, once again, have perspective on everyone who is a part of this dialogue. So we'll give you here a second to select what role you play in church security, or what your connection is with church security, and then we'll uh, we'll close the poll. I see a lot coming through here in my chat. Hopefully, boy, good variety of folks. We have one person who says, "I'm all of the above" on the poll. Yeah, I would say there's probably a lot of people who fit that description as well. All right. Well, boy, based on just the percentage here, looks like the majority are representing ministry leaders, boy, I'm excited to see to see people who are leading our churches, who are just trying to seek answers, trying to seek understanding of what are some concerns that they need to be aware of, and then how do we protect our people. So that's great. Thank you so much for submitting the poll. All right, well, we're going to dive a little bit into um, what is the spectrum of the whole concealed carry discussion. And Brotherhood Mutual created this great chart, and we're going to provide this to you when we send out the link to the webinar. You'll have this as a PDF download. But what I find handy about this is it gives the whole spectrum of all the way from more ministry control, no one is allowed to carry on premises at the church, to all the way to the spectrum of anyone can carry. And each one of those facets of the concealed carry discussion come with their own unique challenges, risks, and opportunities. And Steve, I'd love for you to speak into each one of these, and then we'll kind of camp in one particular area afterward.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we created this piece in the wake of the Sutherland Springs tragedy. And it was because after Sutherland Springs, we were getting hundreds of questions in from ministry leaders across the country. And a lot of times the question is, can we allow firearms on our campus? And then also, should we allow firearms on our campus? And more often than not, we'd have to respond back to say, it's not always a simple yes or no question. And that's because the laws vary significantly from state to state. And it also comes down to understanding your own individual flock. You might live in an area that has strong opinions with respect to firearms, and your congregation might have strong views with respect to firearms. So it is very much an individual ministry decision, but it also is based very specifically on state and local laws wherever you're located. But from a general risk management perspective, this continuum tends to kind of capture the questions that you as a ministry should be walking through if you're evaluating whether to allow firearms on campus and to what extent to allow firearms on campus. And so, Craig, you mentioned kind of the bookends of the continuum, that you might be a church that you just want to take the position that we're going to exert more control here and no one is allowed to carry on premises. And that's okay. There are churches that do that. But you have to understand, from a state law perspective, you might have to post signs or notices to let people know that no firearms are allowed, even if they have a valid concealed carry permit. And then the other thing is making sure that you understand that law enforcement may still validly carry on your premises within the state, even if they're off duty. It depends on state law. But then on the other end of the continuum is you might say, you know what, we're going to exert less control, and that is anyone can carry on our premises. And there's some states that if you don't have a policy or you've never thought about this before, in some states that's the default position, that if you don't have a policy, then anyone with a valid concealed carry permit is allowed to carry on your premises. And then there's other states where the default position is that no one's allowed to carry on premises unless they're granted permission. And so if in those states, if you're going to say anyone can carry, you're going to again have to post notice or signs to let them know. And the other caveat here is, what are you going to do with potential violations? We've worked with some churches that they've said, we're going to allow concealed carry, but if we see it, and certainly if it becomes unholstered, that's a situation that maybe we're not comfortable with because congregants will be uncomfortable. And so if there's a violation where you see a firearm or someone comes in open carry, as a private property owner, you have the ability to restrict that person's attendance or kindly ask them to take it out to their vehicle and store it during services, or conceal it again. So that's the extremes. But what we're finding is that churches are really living in between that when they're evaluating the firearms in the church, and that is, you might have security team, or a vendor, or an internal volunteer team, but you also might want to evaluate: are you going to allow employees and volunteers to carry, or designated congregants or attenders to carry? So, kind of in starting here, on the far left, you have outside security. So some churches have made the decision that we don't have an internal security team, but we're going to hire off-duty law enforcement or an actual security vendor to handle security services during Sunday services or other activities. In doing that, I think there's a few caution areas or words of warning, questions that you want to evaluate, and that is, if you're going to have off-duty police officers, you really want to work with local law enforcement, the municipality or sheriff's department, to identify who is going to pay for workers' compensation and where is that off-duty officer covered if something does happen. And then the other part of it is, if you're going to use a security vendor, you still want to screen them, the vendor itself, to make sure that they have the appropriate licenses, training in place, that they're screening um, their security team members, so that you can evaluate it that way. And then also, most importantly, is anytime you're using a vendor or off-duty police officer, you probably want to evaluate them from a ministry context, and that you don't lose the ministry aspect of safety and security by having someone who's only focused on uh, kind of operating security through authority, because there are ministry opportunities in a lot of these situations as well. And then moving over to the security team, there are a lot of churches, and we really commend churches who are evaluating this and saying, you know what, we have law enforcement, military, and folks who are trained professionals or enthusiasts who really are willing to step up in a big way and serve our church as a security or a safe team member. And that's really awesome that churches are starting to develop security teams. I mean, there are churches who've had security teams in place for over a decade now, but we're seeing more and more churches move in that direction. And in doing that, we think it's really important to have a security plan in place, policies and procedures, that you have a strong, holistic screening process in place, for your security team members, to make sure that you're getting the right people. Maybe the person who is the most excited and gung-ho about serving on the security team might not have the right discernment or temperament in which to serve. So screening those people. You also want to be careful. In certain states, you can't have armed security unless they're licensed, even if it's in a volunteer position. So you want to make sure that you're always complying with state law. And then what we'll talk about here in a little bit is making sure that you're stepping up as a ministry to protect your security team members if they do have to respond uh, to an active shooter situation or an aggressive or violent person, because they could face injury or accusations and things like that. And then the other two that I'll just mention very briefly is, with employees and volunteers or approved attenders, what you want to be thinking about continually, and even on the security context a little bit, is, are you giving someone authority to act, or are you just allowing them to exercise their constitutional right to carry? Because if you're giving them authority to act, that means that you are basically approving them to use force while carrying a firearm. And that comes down to the screening that you put in place, the training that you put in place, and those type of things. So authority versus simply allowing someone to carry are two very different things that I think we'll talk about a little bit more. I will say that there's a lot to this continuum. There's a lot of questions to evaluate. I really recommend that as you look at it, that you identify where you are, whether you've addressed those questions, and see if there's a way you can move into a safer position by addressing these issues.
That's great, Steve. I appreciate you going through each one of those. I oftentimes speak at different security events or hosting security trainings, and I'm finding a trend, and maybe you can speak into this. Is that trend is a tendency to say we know we need the ability to protect ourselves, and we recognize that armed security is the approved response that we would like, but we're not comfortable having a sanctioned security team, but we have sort of an implied security team that and I would say the security team, quasi security team members or volunteer security team members are operating under the typical concealed carry lethal force provisions. If they, it's the ability, opportunity, jeopardy. If there's a threat of lethal force, threat of death or physical, significant bodily harm, they have the ability to defend themselves,
Hmm.
which I think is very clear cut. Okay, person's about to shoot you or kill you, you have the legal right to protect yourself. What I'm finding is where the security team members are at a huge risk is when it's a dangerous situation, it's a volatile situation, but it's not as clear cut as a clear lethal force response. And yet they're still acting on behalf of the church, and yet they have no protections afforded to them, not being identified as a security team member and not being on the insurance policy. So we're going to dive a little bit into those risks. So I would say for the next part of this discussion is really around this authority to act
Hmm.
consideration. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are some of the risks and liabilities that come with having armed security? And I would say that can be sanctioned and determined, but I'm finding more and more they're sort of operating under the radar screen, using their CCW protections in lieu of a more formalized process. And let's talk about the first one. I think it's been my experience that it really opens the church up for a potential lawsuit. Would you mind talking about what would that look like? How would that lawsuit come to bear, and what is their liability?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a misnomer, and I'm going to blame attorneys. 99% of attorneys give the rest of us a bad name, but the thing is that a lot of times attorneys talk in terms of risk is that control equals risk or control equals liability. And so what you said, Craig, is that we're starting to see more and more ministries say, well, we want to, if someone's willing to protect our church, if they're a concealed carry permit holder and we know that we have armed folks on our premises, we're just going to trust that they're going to defend the church if something happens. Or we have folks who are embedded as ushers or greeters, or in our youth or children's ministry, and we know that they carry. And so we're just going to trust that they're going to step up and defend us when an issue arises. And I think the thought process is that we're not exerting any control over them, so we probably don't have any liability, but we know that they're going to protect us if something happens. And and that really kind of turns it on its head a little bit, because what we would say is if a ministry knows that someone is carrying a firearm and they've kind of given implicit permission or authority for this person to act on their behalf. So, for instance, if you have a volunteer who is an usher and the church knows that they carry, and the volunteer has talked about, they will step up and protect the church, and no one in leadership has corrected them and said, hey, just, so you don't have authority to use that firearm on our behalf, but we're allowing you to carry because of your constitutional right. Well, if something were to happen, uh, then that individual volunteer is likely going to say that they believed they had authority to act and they were acting on behalf of the ministry. And so the ministry has potential exposure there. I'll give an example of a claim that we had, and it really is a terrible claim. Uh, we insured a church in which there was an individual who was on the autism spectrum, and he was disruptive, agitated, and a bit violent, sitting in the back of the church. And some volunteers came over to him and tried to kind of de-escalate the situation. And as they went to get someone more senior who might be able to handle the situation, a congregant who um, had a concealed carry permit and was armed came over and took it upon himself to tell the individual that he needed to leave. and that individual pushed him and then punched him, and the congregant took out his gun and shot the gentleman who was aggressive. Um, and he actually was criminally charged. And the question became, did the church implicitly authorize him to act because they didn't, question his carrying, and they didn't have a security team in place or anything like that? And this is the issue that we can potentially get into, is because you have someone who is known to the church to carry, is allowed to carry, but feels like they've been authorized to act on behalf of the church, but has never, to their knowledge, gone through any training or screening to recognize, do they have the right discernment to say, when is it appropriate to use lethal force? When is it appropriate to use any form of force? And unfortunately, he was criminally charged for unreasonable use of force in the death of this gentleman. And so taking a hands-off approach does increase the risk of potential liability if you're confusing the issue of authority to act versus allowed to carry.
Hmm. Well, you hit on something that we'll jump into the next point, which is another risk, is unqualified or untrained individuals potentially overreacting. And maybe in
Mhm.
that situation, that's a glaring example of an overreaction, but potentially underreacting, where someone it's clear grounds for lethal force, but their lack of training, underreacting in that situation too. What's thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, we would look at, and I'm going to talk more in terms of security teams. When you have a team of volunteers, I think it's very important for churches to be very explicit with what they are authorizing a security team to do. So there are some churches that say our security team of volunteers are in an observe and report capacity. And so they might make the decision not to allow them to carry firearms because it's purely observe and report, and that is to authorities. You might have an off-duty officer on premises, so the security team observes something, they report it to the off-duty officer, and the officer takes control of it. If you have an observe and report structure, but you allow security team members to carry firearms, you have implicitly elevated that to an authorized to respond security team. And that is that whatever they do is going to be deemed as on behalf of the church. So if they have a firearm or the ability to use force, you want to make sure that you're doing the right qualification and the right training. And so that's firearms training. That's verbal de-escalation tactics, defense tactics. So actually, close quarter altercations and things like that, so that someone does have the right discernment. They know the right response. I think of a book called uh, The Power of Moments, in which it talks about practicing courage, and in doing that, folks who go through it over and over in their mind or through physical repetition, they know how they're going to respond in a certain situation. So that way, there's no overreacting or underreacting, and you hopefully minimize the risk of any accusations of um, unlawful use of force. Or the alternative, like you said, Craig, is underreacting in the situation and not taking someone out, or using appropriate force to hopefully save people's lives, or at least save people from injury.
Yeah, and oftentimes we're talking about force being the ultimate end of that spectrum of lethal force, but
Hmm.
there are varying degrees of force in the force continuum, all the way from just officer presence to um, de-escalation, verbal communication, to some other levels of physical force leading up to it. So you're hitting it right on the head. Is that it's a full understanding of the whole force continuum, but also what's an appropriate level of
Hmm.
force based on the situation. Let's talk a little bit about the third, is little to no protection for the security member if they're involved in an incident.
Yeah, so this is very interesting, because we're seeing this happen more and more with security team members who have told the ministry, we are willing to step up in a big way for the church. That is, this is our church, this is our family, this is our home, and if someone threatens it, we're willing to use force, de-escalate the situation, even put our own lives in danger. And what we're finding is that, especially on the insurance and liability perspective, there's a huge gap for security team members. And that is that a lot of insurance policies have what's called an intentional acts exclusion. And so if someone intentionally harms another, then there may not be any coverage under the ministry's insurance policy or under the individual security team member's policy. And, here at Brotherhood Mutual, we made the decision several years ago, actually, that we try to understand ministry, understand the concerns of ministry. And if you're going to have somebody step up in a big way for your ministry, you want to make sure that the ministry is stepping up for them as well. And so, we created a security operations liability endorsement that provides coverage for security team members so they don't have to go to their homeowner's insurance if something happens. It gives them money to pay for medical bills if they're injured while acting on behalf of the ministry, gives them lost wages if they have to miss work. It gives them counseling coverage as well, because if they ever have to use force, there's probably going to be an emotional or psychological fallout from that. And then in addition to that, traumatic incident response is providing coverage for any victims or family members of victims or eyewitnesses to some sort of tragedy that occurs on ministry property or during a ministry activity. So that's a huge gap for ministries, that they're getting security volunteers, but they're not making sure that they're protecting those volunteers for if something were to happen. So my biggest encouragement, there's a question on the continuum. My biggest encouragement is, if you have a security team, you go back to your insurance agent, your insurance carrier, and ask them what the coverage is for your security team. If they have to use lethal force or any type of physical force, making sure that you have coverage for them in that respect. Same thing if they're ever charged criminally, there's some defense coverage for someone who might be charged unfairly for unlawful use of force. And so stepping up and protecting them is very important.
Well, there's a lot of questions pouring in. I'm going to hit one that was a quick question you mentioned earlier, Steve, about it's important to know what your local laws are. Are you aware of any online kind of repository of information where people can easily access what the local laws, or do you have any recommendations so they can find that information?
Yeah, so when it comes to concealed carry laws, the NRA has a 50-state resource available on their website. Most state police or state highway patrol, or just state websites will have explanations with respect to um, concealed carry laws, and even how it interacts with churches, because churches, depending on the state, are treated differently than other private property. Same thing is, if you're a ministry that has a school on premises, you might be treated differently as well, in that you might not be permitted to have firearms on your campus.
Or if
And
your church is hosted at a school,
correct.
wow.
Yeah, and so in that regard, it gets a little bit more cumbersome. I would say that there's two or three encouragements there. We're going to talk about here in a little bit, but Brotherhood Mutual has a legal assist program, and that is that any ministry, whether they're insured with us or not, can contact us and ask any legal question that they'd like, including kind of um, questions on the state of the law and firearms in churches and things like that. We get a lot of those questions. And so we're happy to help out and point you in the right direction through Legal Assist. Again, we can't offer legal advice, but we will definitely get you pointed in the right direction so you can understand the law, and then the state law. And then the other part of it is just uh, knowing that you have local attorneys who can probably find the appropriate statutes within a few minutes of time. And talking with local attorneys is really important, invaluable when it comes to prepping for things like this.
Steve, a lot of questions just came in on, we'd mentioned about this protections for the security team member, and a lot of security team folks have supplemental insurance through some of the different CCW programs
Sure.
out there. NRA has them. What's your response to those supplemental insurance protections for security team members?
Yeah, those are good programs to have for sure, and they definitely help. And I know that one of them, the NRA program, that also dealt with if you're accused of unreasonable use of force. So they vary quite a bit, and some states don't allow those type of coverages or personal lines, and so you want to evaluate that. But the other thing is, so having that personal is good. I would verify that it provides liability coverage, that it does provide kind of the fallout of counseling, lost wages, medical, if personal property is damaged. And then the other part of it is making sure that it is going to defend you if there's any type of criminal uh, accusation or criminal indictment, with that respect. And you can go that route. I think it's where our philosophy is a little bit different. It's a cost shifting, is that we say, we're just going to add it as an endorsement to the insurance policy. And so it becomes cheaper, and it's not pushing the cost onto the individual security team member necessarily.
Hmm. Well, as we start to get into this next portion, which is ways you can mitigate your risk, and we've kind of highlighted a few of those, I want to call out one of the comments that was made was, and maybe there's others on the webinar today who are thinking this, is that, wow, there's so much risk associated with a church security team. Is it just better to get an off-duty officer?
Mm.
I know I have my personal opinion. This is that having volunteer security team is a wonderful asset to the church. It taps into ways to be able to serve, and it provides an affordable option for churches of any size to be able to protect their people. So I think for some churches, an off-duty officer makes sense if that's the decision they're out to go. But my hope is that you're not hearing me discourage from having a security team. I'm just really advocating for the due diligence to uh, train the team, prepare the team, ensure the team. What's your feeling on that, Steve?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say they're not mutually exclusive either.
Mm,
So having an off-duty officer on site is really valuable. Even having, that marked police car sitting in the parking lot provides a layer of security or deterrence. But a lot of times when we talk about security teams, our mind automatically goes to an active shooter situation.
correct.
And that's very important. Having a security team of volunteers, that this is their home, this is their church, they should have a basic understanding of evacuation procedures. And so if you ever have to evacuate or shelter in place, having a security team uh, basically makes that more efficient and more safe. And then the other side of it is medical response. As a church, we're much more likely to face someone having a cardiac event or a seizure or a stroke or a terrible fall or injury. And so even empowering your security team members to be trained in CPR and medical response is extremely valuable. So I think you're absolutely right, Craig, is we would never want to deter anyone from setting up a security team. That I strongly believe that the advantages far outweigh the negatives. Um, and having a security team, whether they're in an observe and report capacity or whether they're trained to respond, you're going to have value there, in being able to spot issues. And then also going back to the other part that I mentioned is always maintaining that ministry mindset
Yeah.
as well, because this is their home, this is their church. So if your mission is helping people find and follow Jesus, your security team is going to be able to operate under that mission as well. And that's important.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know my experiences on our team have been far more centered around medical issues than
Mm.
security issue related issues. That's an excellent point. Well, let's talk a little bit about mitigating those risks. And so if your church has decided to have armed security, or really honestly any security presence, these are some of the considerations that we would recommend. First is develop clear policies and procedures for the authorized use of force. You mentioned on one end of the spectrum that you're there to observe and report, and that fits a lot of churches. I would say also you see the whole spectrum of that they are authorized to use lethal force if need be. So, but it's what, regardless of what you decide, it's important that you have clear, documented policies and procedures around that use of force. And we have some suggestions here as we start to talk into the resourcing, ways to help develop your policies and procedures or enhance your policies procedures, because your ministry needs are going to evolve as your church evolves. And that's an important way to be able to serve that. So let's look at maybe the next one. Legitimize the presence of armed security. By having it sanctioned by the church and insured. We've talked a lot about that. It doesn't work to allow it to allow that responsibility to be displaced on the security team members without um, legitimizing the security team and developing it, training it, and really validating the contribution that they're making in service to the church. And so I hopefully you have heard through the webinar today that you can't just wash your hands of it and feel like, well, we don't have any culpability or responsibility to it. It is that implied role and responsibility to act that really um, is the part that we're trying to uncover here in this webinar, and it's an important conversation to be able to have as you legitimize those teams. The last is provide training opportunities and require proficiency standards be met. Training opportunities, I have found that most security team members are hungry for training opportunities. It's a way to enhance their skills and abilities, whether or not that is first aid training, having your people certified in CPR and basic first aid, having your team trained in de-escalation and tactical communications, having people trained in scenario-based training in your environment. We oftentimes think, once again, to the end of the spectrum of, okay, what is concealed carry lethal force response training? But once again, statistically, that's a low probability in your church. You need to be prepared for it and trained for it, but it's much more important that you're trained around the things that you're most likely to encounter. And then for those who do have a firearms armed presence, I can't stress enough the need to have proficiency standards, that there's a qualification standard that the armed team members have to meet and maintain to continue to be sanctioned by the church to be on the armed team. And for our security team, our proficiency qualification standards are in keeping with our local law enforcement standards, and the idea being defensibility. If our standards are ever called into question, then it's obviously very defensible to be able to say we meet the same standards of our local police department, and that those our team members are required to maintain that standard. A question came in is, do you run police officers through that as well? We do. We have several retired off-duty officers on our team, and we encourage them to come and participate in our qualification standards as well. That way it's documented in our own records, and it's a great opportunity for them to train and be a part of our team, and to mentor some of the other members on the team too. So I'm a big fan of having our law enforcement folks be very active in our training experiences and have them even contribute in some of the training, scenario-based training. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the resourcing opportunities. Steve, you hit it. You mentioned Brotherhood Mutual's Legal Assist. Maybe you can give a little bit of, this entails not only uh, questions that are frequently asked questions, but you have the ability to actually speak to someone at Brotherhood Mutual. Am I correct?
Yeah, this is actually one of the things that I love most about what I do and what our legal department does. You don't see a lot of in-house legal departments that get to work with the customer or the ministry on a day in, day out basis. And that's exactly what we get to do through Legal Assist. And I wholeheartedly believe it's the most important thing we do because it keeps us closest to our mission of advancing the kingdom by serving the church. And so right now with Legal Assist, it's been around for 10 years. We get about 250 questions per month from ministries across the country. And they range from, you know, taking a look at a child protection policy, to reviewing a contract that the church is considering entering into, to being in the midst of a current pressing situation, whether there's been an accusation or a rumor against the church and you're dealing with some public relations issues, or you have a sex offender attending the church and you're wondering what steps should you take to protect the church while still ministering to the sex offender. And then obviously from a safety and security perspective, we get a lot of questions on policies and procedures, reviewing those policies and procedures, and navigating having a security team, a medical response team, and firearms in the church and things like that. So it's one of those things that we love to do. Again, I can't emphasize enough, it's a completely free service, whether you're insured with us or not. So I really encourage folks to use us. And the other advantage of this is we can start seeing trends as they come in, questions that are repeated over and over and over again from ministries in different geographical areas. And when we see those trends, what we do is on our Legal Assist page, we create a frequently asked question. And so you, as a ministry leader, can go click on that website and you'll see resources of these frequently asked legal assist questions that come in about what ministries are facing. So we have a plethora of resources on safety and security, on child protection, on employment matters, and things like that. And it's just one of the things that I love about what we do.
Yeah, what a huge gift to the church to be able to provide that counsel, and I love that you extend that whether or not you're a Brotherhood Mutual customer or not. That's fantastic. Another resource we want you to know about is the Safe and Secure Church, the Ministry Approach Training Kit. This was a resource that was created in cooperation between Group Publishing and Brotherhood Mutual, and it contains published resources that will help you develop your policies and procedures and best practices for your security teams as you engage leadership. You start to look at how do we evaluate our ministries to help keep them more safe. All of those considerations are in this fantastic resource. But we also took great care in creating video resources that can be used to train the team. What I have found on my team, and you may find this in your ministries as well, is that the published resources only go so far, but video-based training is probably the most effective way to engage people and communicate these concepts in a way that will be applied. So there are 10 DVDs in the kit that address everything from principles for your leadership to consider, like what's the role of security, how do you protect children and youth, how do you assess your risk, understanding your liability, and building your teams, to training videos around de-escalating dangerous situations. Uh, how do you spot danger? What would happen during and after a major incident? And then we also included scenario training around security issues and scenario training around medical issues. So this is a comprehensive training kit that you can use to develop your team, and that's available on group.com/security. You can read more about that. We're also doing security training around the country. I'll be this weekend in Boyd's, Maryland, leading them. We have great trainings planned around the country here in 2018, but look for a lot of those training opportunities. If you'd like to take your teams through a training experience that is really developed from the concepts and vision for the ministry kit, as Steve indicated, focusing on how do we keep people safe and secure while still meeting the ministry mission of our church. That's a unique distinctive of the Shepherd's Watch approach. And so those trainings, if you would like to find those locations and be informed of upcoming trainings, go to group.com security training. I also want to, if you enjoyed this conversation, Steve and I will be on a panel together at the Future of the Church Summit here at Group Publishing's headquarters in Loveland on October 24th through 26th, where we'll be talking a lot about what we talked about today, but it's a phenomenal summit where we really talk about a lot of the issues that are affecting the local church and what will be the challenges of the church for the church tomorrow. So I encourage you to come join us for the Future of the Church Summit later in October. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We hope that this webinar was offered a lot of questions and hopefully answered some of those questions. We'll be sending you a link to the webinar that you can share with your teams, and we'll also include that link to the PDF of that concealed carry continuum chart. Hopefully that'll be helpful. We will also, if there's any questions that you have around any of the information that we provided, we'll try to include that into the webinar as well. We'll include a link to the Legal Assist link, that way you can access that. We just want to, again, thank you for caring about this topic, being interested in finding ways to understand and mitigate your risk, and we appreciate your service to your church and for just helping people grow in their relationship with Jesus Christ. Steve, I want to thank you for your time and your amazing wisdom today, and appreciate all that you do to further God's kingdom, but also to help us protect the people that are in our churches.
Oh, absolutely. Happy to be here. And I just want to say thanks to Paul, who just thanked us. So appreciate that, Paul.
Yes, thanks, Paul. Well, thank you all again. Look for the link with the recording of the webinar and have a great rest of your day. Take care and God bless.